tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. All right, so let's talk about fullness a bit. This came out of a comment at the end of a class a couple weeks ago. I think it might have been this group 2 weeks ago, something like that, where I gave an answer to a question that is the kind of thing that I often give. And, it's a little bit philosophical shorthand. And so I wanted to expand on it a bit here. The answer was really, in a way, about the conversation was really about the doorways or pathways we pass through or move along in the process of growing in wisdom, growing toward liberation. One way of asking a question might be, how should we train in perceiving the world if our goal is freedom from suffering? And the goal matters here, because there's lots of different ways you could perceive the world. You could perceive the world aesthetically. And so you're looking for beauty in various ways, however you define that, right? You're looking at the presentation, the performance, the appearance, the display of phenomena. And you're taking it in as an aesthetic experience. And this is a kind of eros. This is a kind of embodied relationship to the world. That's a doorway you can go through. You can look at the world through a kind of ethical doorway, where the main thing you're looking at is right and wrong. Is it right? Is this right? Is this wrong? What's right to do? How should we act? And if you're looking through that lens, or practicing on that pathway, maybe you're not attending to the aesthetic so much. Like, maybe the beauty of the thing, when you're practicing in that way, is less important than its efficacy. What does it actually do? Does it hurt people? Does it help? What does it do to ecosystems, etc.? And in Buddhist practice, there's a few primary doorways or pathways that are often emphasized. And one of those main doorways is a deconstructive or analytical doorway. And this is what I might point to if I was going to use a term like emptiness. I might say, here's a way of being in relationship to the world, and really not just being in relationship to, but really investigating, wanting to understand the world that we live in, because I want to be free from suffering, that uses the power of awareness and the power of discernment to investigate our ongoing experience and to compare it against a set of theories, essentially, that the Buddhist system preserved and developed. These would be, hypotheses like clinging to things that we want, even though they are impermanent and unreliable, because they are impermanent and reliable, is going to cause suffering, some kind of emotional distress. That's a proposal. That's the proposal of the second noble truth. Part of our practice, part of the practice of vipassana particularly, and mindfulness practices, is to investigate our ongoing experience to see if this is true, right? And the Buddha said, don't believe it just because I said it. Come and see it for yourself. Is this true? Because the assumption or the habit that we might make, understandably, would be something like things that feel good are good and things that feel bad are bad. We should have more of the things that feel good and less of the things that feel bad. That is a really naturalistic, understandable, organic feeling. And it's shared seemingly by lots of kinds of animals, right? All sorts of animals of different kinds, including perhaps plants, depending on how you read their actions and their emotional states, are drawn toward that which feels good, satisfies hungers, feels pleasurable in the bodies that we have, and recoil from pain. And of course we do, right? So we might assume then that you call that like the somatic lens, like that's a very bodily, energetic way of experiencing the world. That way of understanding the world is not necessarily accurate in relation to being happy, right? Accurate meaning helpful, really, right? So then the Buddha comes along and says, oh, I'm gonna interrupt that habit that you've got going on. You're assuming that feels good equals is good and feels bad equals is bad. And I'm going to interrupt that with an ethical lens and a liberation lens. The technical term for the liberation lens is soteriological. So you can use that word if you like words like that. That means having to do with salvation. So the Buddha's ethical lens is that it's not so much about how things feel, pleasant, unpleasant. He says that changes all the time. What's more important is the effect that experiences have in terms of causing suffering or not. So this thing that feels good but hurts people, he says, not good actually. Feels good but isn't good because it causes harm. This thing that hurts a bit but actually leads to freedom or clarity or doesn't hurt someone else, better, right? So sitting through discomfort in meditation, better than gaining some minor satisfaction in an argument by saying something cruel to somebody and really hurting them. So the Buddha brings in the ethical lens as the first layer of like reprogram your habitual relationship with the world using this different lens. Go through this different doorway. That's a foundation. Going further than the early texts will propose, now with that as a basis, like you have to do that just to be able to concentrate and settle down and stop hurting people. But with that as a foundation, then now get even more still and turn that basic ethical lens into a subtler analysis of ongoing experience, where we begin to really notice not just what actions cause harm, but what states of mind and heart bring about suffering. In a way, it's the same thing. It's still the ethical lens. It's just more refined. And now I'm seeing that when I fixate on things like who I am and who other people are and the story about our relating, that to do that relies on narrative assumptions that are untrue. And that when I see that, I can unhook from those relational and emotional patterns in a way that makes me more free. So like, if I think this body is me, and particularly the body I had when I was 25 and dancing all the time, and and I was strong and beautiful, and and I could sing, and like whatever your thing is, right? If I had the idea that that was me, then I might really be suffering now, that much time again later, where the body's not the same, right? It's not as young, it's not as beautiful by the standards of the 25-year-old. It's not as capable by the standards of the 25-year-old. Maybe by its own standards now. There's things I was popping up into handstands then in a way that I don't pop at the moment, right? That was 25. It was great. But to the extent that I identified with that, this is me, right? And how much do we do this? I'm going to suffer when that changes. And so if I make anything into myself, I'm going to suffer when that changes, and it will change, right? If I generate an identity around my race or my social class, and then that identity comes into conflict in the world with others and with my idea about, who should be on the top of the social ladder, for instance, I'm going to suffer. If I can soften that attachment, that clinging to an identity, for instance, I'll suffer less. This was at the heart of the Buddha's realization. And he did it by seeing his past lives. So he was like, why identify with this changing body when I've already had a gazillion of them and they've all grown old and died or been murdered in various ways? Clearly, this body is not myself, right? This body is clearly is one manifestation in an ongoing process. And so that analysis points to the emptiness of things, right? It points to how everything is in process. Nothing can be called truly mine, and nothing can be pinned down as being any one thing for very long. And that means that nothing means anything for very long. Meaning attaches to something in a momentary coming together of, erotic fullness of, like life, and then it dissolves again a moment later. And the emphasis in the early texts is not on the erotic fullness of life that is being manifested. The emphasis is on how fixating that hurts. And if I can see how fixating on that hurts, I will let go and be free from that hurt. And so the emphasis then is not on the fullness itself, but is really on what that fullness is lacking, which is permanence, satisfactoriness, solid identity. And so in the Pali Canon and the Chinese Agamas, the record of the early Buddhist teachings, we don't find much praise of fullness. We don't find the effulgence of existence praised, because the Buddha is really a pragmatist. He's not an ecstatic mystic in the way that some later ecstatic mystics would talk rapturously about what they see in meditation that the world is. The Buddha would say, what I've seen is like all the leaves in this entire forest. What I'm teaching you is just this little handful of leaves, because this is what will actually help you get free. If I take that metaphor seriously, I might read into that even from my limited viewpoint, I can see that the world contains, as my teacher Jack loves to quote, 10,000 joys and 10,000 sorrows. It contains all sorts of effulgent beauty and all sorts of horrific, terrible shit that is very unpleasant to be in relationship to and to know exists. All of that's real. And the Buddha would say, given the reality of all this, let's just focus on what's going on in my own heart and mind that is making me miserable and how I can get free from that. So the early texts do not emphasize fullness. They don't emphasize interconnectedness. They don't emphasize interdependence. All of those ideas came later. And I think what happened is something like this, right? The Buddha lays out this very pragmatic, soteriological, right? Like liberation-oriented framework. But at the heart of that framework, as we've talked about a lot, is meditation. And the meditation that is at the heart of the Buddhist framework is actually quite ecstatic. It's quite pleasurable and embodied. And depending on what kind of words you use for bodily energy, can be quite sexy, which is to say, full of aliveness, It can be full of vitality, right? The word rapture, piti, points to a kind of effulgent vitality that can be felt in meditation. And the Buddha's, initiating insight before he was even liberated, the insight that pointed him toward the path at all was the insight that bodily, energetic pleasure in meditation was safe and wholesome, was not to be feared. He had come from an ascetic system that really feared the body and feared pleasure. And he came to the conclusion that pleasure of the meditative sort was not to be feared. Now, he did not turn into a hedonist. He did not go back into lay life and go back to the life of feasts and orgies and, consuming sensual pleasures. He devotedly praised the ascetic life of wilderness living and simplicity of needs and celibacy and sensory restraint. He praised that for his entire life. But he did it, I think, partly because he was able to access these extraordinary states of joy and ease in his being. I don't think any spiritual system survives if it doesn't include rapturous ecstasy. So he teaches this system, teaches these extraordinary meditations that are, for many people, a reliable pathway toward a deep embodied satisfaction. They actually help unbind us from less reliable sensual satisfactions, because they're always there for you. If you can learn to concentrate the mind even a little bit, even if you have the experience, which I know many of you have, where in the middle of the swirl of your life, sitting down for meditation is like, like finally I just get to land and things are simple and peaceful, and there's a kind of deep pleasure and sweetness just in that, even if the mind is nuts, but there's a pleasure in just landing. That's the beginning of this thing that this meditation points to. So we have an ecstatic meditation tradition held within a very sober renunciate framework. That itself is a really nice social construction. Like there's a really clear boundary, so people are protected from getting into trouble, which is very helpful in spiritual systems. And then within that boundary, especially within the strong boundary of the monastic system, people are doing this like really vibrating thing, and so that gets taught. And then some centuries go by and people are meditating, and some people really specialize in meditation, some people specialize in study and memorization, other things. But the people that specialize in meditation find that you can go pretty far with this. And you can actually go further, perhaps, than the Buddha may even have been suggesting. In other words, you can go so deeply into samadhi, concentrated stillness, that the body dissolves, that sounds disappear, sensations disappear, everything turns to light. Like that thing goes far in the direction of dissolving and ecstatic states. And so, that's great, right? The Buddha recommended those. But if you're practicing those, what is, it's not like everyone practicing meditation is doing only, the very specific handful of leaves that the Buddha brought forward. Some people clearly wandered off into other parts of the forest. They've got some meditative power and they start having visionary experiences, because from those deep concentrated states, just turning on the image channel, and it turns itself on sometimes for some folks, turning on the inner eye, right? The old Sanskrit word would be the Agnya chakra. And Agnya, really means the wisdom eye. The Gnya is knowledge, wisdom. It's the eye of wisdom. You turn on the eye of wisdom and it sees things. And so people would develop psychic powers, people would develop, visionary experience. And they started to write these visionary experiences down. And if you are a deeply faithful Buddhist practitioner and you're starting to have visionary experiences, what's gonna appear to your inner eye? Well, what's gonna appear, of course, is visions of Buddhas and cosmic realms. And so you start to see in the Mahayana texts descriptions of cosmic Buddhas sitting on lion thrones as big as planets, radiating rainbow light from tufts of hair at their third eye, illuminating the trichiliocosm. I don't even know what that means. It means like universes upon universes of spaces filled with spirit beings and enlightened beings and devotees and bodhisattvas of all ranges and dragons and fairies and all of this like shot through with light. And you start to see descriptions of all this stuff. And that, as it develops over the centuries, unfolds what comes to be called the Mahayana. And the Mahayana, or the great vehicle, or the vast encompassing chariot that takes all to liberation, comes, I think, out of these extraordinary visionary meditative experiences. And it starts to mix with a development in the philosophy that goes something like this. Nothing is fixed, everything is impermanent. We know this from the earliest texts, from the very, very beginning of Vipassana, from observing. If everything is unfixed, what actually is happening when you see this and then it changes and then it changes? What is real or here, or what is experience when what we can observe is a scintillating, vibrating mass of lots of different stuff happening all at the same time, right? And this is actually a relatively nearby meditative state to get into. In the Burmese system, or the Visuddhimagga system, this is called the stage of arising and passing, or you can get it into the Vipassana stage. It's the fourth of the Vipassana insights, where you're observing so closely, right? I see that, I hear that, I feel this, until suddenly it's like a strobe light state of I think basically what you're doing is you're noticing how quickly attention moves between sensory locations. And you notice that in order to perceive the flow of experience that we perceive, what we're actually doing is the brain is logging, cello, painting, light, person, bing, 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 all the things, sensation, other sensation, breath, this sensation. And if you're really still and mindfulness is really bright and you don't hook onto any of them, like you don't try to stay with something, you just let it arise and pass, what you get is this kind of vibrating state, right? And so from that realization, like, oh, things are like that, you can perceive the world like that, I think it really makes sense to my mind and my, somatic soterial, I'm just confusing the word soteriological to teach the word, my soteriological intuition, that you would go from that state of everything vibrating into an understanding that everything in the universe and all the universe is doing that. It's all vibrating. It's all present all at once. Thoughts of the past are just more vibration. Planning of the future is just more vibration. So now we're getting toward fullness. We're starting to get things that the Buddha didn't himself initially say, but that I think are implied by the meditative techniques he taught, that you can perceive the universe as a scintillating, infinitely full field of aliveness, something like that. Take that perception and mix it with the teaching of karma, which says that all actions have results. And then and that the experience of any moment is conditioned by everything that happened before. If you mix those two theories, you get interdependence and interconnection. The early theory of karma, dependent origination in the early Buddhist teachings, it was not saying every experience depends on every other experience in the universe. It was much more limited. It was like, my experience of being unhappy today, partly depends on, my attachment system from my childhood in this lifetime. And maybe that depends on my actions in the past lifetime. And maybe it just depends on what I ate and how my sweetheart and I were talking with each other yesterday, and it's still with me. But a relatively limited set of conditions. Part of what I think is really brilliant and helpful about the little handful of leaves, which is why I mostly teach from the early texts, not the Mahayana, is that the little handful of leaves is pragmatic. It actually gives me something to do. I can attend to how I'm talking with my sweetheart, what I'm eating, and how I deal with my nervous system. And really that's enough, more or less. As soon as you abstract that though, right? So you take two early teachings, you take the teaching of causality, and then you take the meditative experience of everything vibrating, you mix them together, and what you get is the early teachings that would become infinite interdependence. And you get in the Huayan lineage of Chinese Buddhism, it's a kind of a precursor to Zen. You get in the Avatamsaka Sutra, you get the image of Indra's net, which is like an infinite grid or web. It's a net, but think of it in 3 dimensions, or 4 or 5 or 10, or however, whatever your attention can do with dimensions. All of existence is shot through with this infinite matrix of little balls of light. They're like drops of water or gems. And they do the thing that little tiny lucid, gems will do, which is that they reflect everything around them. Like if a tiny spherical gem or a drop of water reflects everything around it. And so then the image goes, every drop reflects every other drop, right? And so Thich Nhat Hanh would become really famous for this. In this piece of paper is the trees and the clouds and the rain and the mycelium and the loggers and the, it goes infinite immediately, right? This is an implication, I think, of the early teachings that wasn't fleshed out in the little handful of leaves, but that makes sense if you take some of those early teachings to their logical conclusion in the context of ecstatic meditation. When we talk about fullness now, and we're getting to the end here, so I'll continue this next week. We'll do modernism next week. But when we talk about fullness now, we take an extra step. And so I'm going to say what that step is, but I'm going to stay with the sort of infinite Mahayana for the moment tonight. The extra step we take is that we mix that Mahayana mysticism with modernist, individualist, like personality and politics. We mix it with the social now. So now interdependence can be used as a way to talk about, activism, for instance. Like we're all connected, therefore we should care for the earth. We're all connected, therefore we should do something about poverty. We should care for the earth and do something about poverty, but there's a ways to go between the non-dual vision of the universe as an infinite matrix of infinitely reflecting lights to get to the specific policy proposal that we should do something about social difference in the present. So we'll talk about that more next time, because I want to finish just with laying a couple more terms out for our conversation. and then we'll see if there's some responses. What the Mahayana vision leads us to, and I think this is again implied in the early texts. So I am, I don't want to lean into any ideas that the Mahayana was a radical break from the early system, or that somehow these views are incompatible. They're completely compatible philosophically and meditatively, I think. The place that they are challenging is political. And so we'll talk about that soon. But the thing that the Mahayana vision points to is what's called in theology a monism, meaning everything is one thing. And it's an idealistic monism. Idealistic doesn't mean like I think it's the best. Idealism means it's like one pure concept. And so a monistic idealism is like the pinnacle of Advaita Vedanta that says that everything is God. That's a monism. And Zen is a monistic sect of Buddhism, right? Every being has Buddha nature, or everything manifests Buddha nature, all right? The implication in monisms is unifying, right? If you can tune into the fact that everything is divine or everything is empty, that's also a monism. You have access, at least initially intellectually, maybe you have access to it in meditation, to the felt sense or the philosophical understanding that everything is at its heart one thing. There's one activity going on. And I think these big ecstatic meditations in the Mahayana, this is what they led to, is a kind of radical monism. Now, the thing about idealisms and monisms, I'm conflating the two a bit, and there's some philosophical difference, but for now, we're going to let them be just two words for the same kind of thing. One of the things that Zen really goes for around monism is that it erases, or at least really marginalizes, the ethical doorway, because good and bad action very quickly in those kinds of meditative states cease to be important. Now, when you're in deep stillness meditation and you're coursing in the ecstatic vibratory aliveness of the universe, presumably you're in a safe enough situation that no one's hurting you, and you're not hurting anyone else in that moment. And that's one of the main reasons why the Buddha called those states not to be feared. That's a pleasure not to be feared, because you're not hurting, you can't hurt anybody else. You're not taking anything away from anybody else. You're not using anybody else's resources. Those states are safe. And so when you're in them, they turn down the volume on discrimination. Discrimination meaning like seeing the separateness of things. You don't really see the divisions of things. Those are states where everyone is equally beautiful, equally worthy, equally anything. No one is anything in those states, right? And so, and you can go emptiness or fullness from those states. The thing that matters is that it's a blanket statement. It covers everybody. The thing we'll talk about next week with modernism, the thing that folks want to do, however, with interdependence is actually have the soul nourishment of perceiving interdependence and union, but retain the discriminatory ability of the mind. Because, and not for bad reasons, right? If you want to figure out who to prosecute for climate crimes, you have to figure out who to prosecute. And it's not everybody, right? So you have to actually come down out of indiscriminate union into difference, right? If you want to defend, if you want to defend people's rights to any particular thing, bodily autonomy, reproductive rights, if you want to work for racial justice or class justice, you have to divide people into groups in order to move resources around appropriately and advocate appropriately. And so the the rub with the Mahayana that is so interesting is that the heart of the theology and the meditative practice points to a kind of radical washing out of difference. But the heart of the engaged practice that images like the idea of the bodhisattva seem to suggest depends on skillfully using discrimination and difference in order to bring about change. And so then, to thread those together, we need to bring in some other ideas that really entered the Western Buddhist world in the 19th century and in the Romantic period around what it actually means to be individuals in relation to nature and each other on a planet that was in the middle of the extraordinary trauma of the colonial period. And so ideas from Protestant Christianity that are romantic and idealist in a different way come in to, and borrow Mahayana ideas of Indra's web and interconnectedness in order to support a socially progressive politic. But it got complicated. So we'll do that complication next week. But for this week, I'll stop there, just feeling, I think the heart here is feeling the difference and the evolutionary kind of unfolding between the early practice that emphasizes impermanence, distinction, and a kind of pragmatic, liberation-oriented investigation into a more ecstatic, mystical, meditative consciousness that points toward big, idealistic union. And in doing so, actually completely changes the ideal of liberation. Because if everything is one thing, liberation is actually not necessary, right? And that's where you get all the doctrines of like, you're already liberated. You just forgot. And the Buddha would never say that. He said, no, you're not already liberated. You're not liberated until you're liberated. It's very straightforward. If you're suffering, you're not liberated. And Zen will come in, turn that completely on its head, and say, you're already liberated because everything has Buddha nature. Everything is intrinsically already free. Even suffering is already liberated. That there's nothing actually excluded from the one, which of course is true, must be true. And so that becomes challenging in practice because that can really drive you into a ditch in terms of figuring out how to actually use your time on the cushion and in your life if you want to be happy. And this challenge, I think, is partly unique to us because this is one of the only times in the history of the world that the many different Buddhist traditions have actually been in conversation with each other. Zen didn't encounter the early tradition until essentially yesterday. And so we are still figuring out what actually is the repercussions of like learning from every single sect all at once. Like it would be absurd for a Protestant in the 1950s to be like, I study all the Protestant teachings, but I also study the Catholics and I also study the Sufis and I also read Krishna texts, and their neighbors in Cork would be like, what are you doing, man? And anyway, so their neighbors in Belfast, I made them Protestant, so they're in Belfast. But that would be considered really confused in that context. And so we are the confused ones in this context if we're actually trying to figure out how to integrate teachings that are separated by thousands of miles and 1,000 years of religious evolution and think that they should be saying the same thing, because they're not.